Please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment where you are watching in the world. Please submit your horror dating stories by our email in the description to us. You will also be entered into our $10 monthly prize. When I just finished college, I was living in a one-bedroom townhouse/split. I met a guy on Plenty of Fish, and at that time I wasn't exactly smart about my online digital footprint. Not like I've really changed, but at least now I'm not as ridiculous. Anyways, he seemed like a decent guy. He was really good looking, said he had a good job, nice teeth, don't judge me, and looked like he cared about his personal health. All things I would typically look for in a guy. I'm not a shallow human, but I like to be presentable, and if I'm with someone I would like them to care about being presentable in a business environment also. After about a week of chatting online, we agreed to meet. We met at a restaurant downtown, which was really far from where I lived. When I got there I noticed him standing at the door. We sat down to eat, and the evening went great. At the end of the date we said bye, and I got into my car and began to drive away. I realized right away that he was following me. Because of the distance to my house, I wasn't immediately scared because it's a big city. Maybe he'll turn off the freeway. He didn't. My exit was coming up, and I decided not to take it. I kept driving. I circled the entire city on the freeway, and he stayed right behind me. I was starting to panic a bit, so I decided to go to my friend's house instead of mine, and when I pulled out the exit I noticed he didn't. So I had a little bit of a moment to breath and decided, okay, screw it, I'll just go home. I took the off-ramp back onto the freeway and began going back to my exit. I got home and showered and was getting ready for bed, and I started feeling dumb because was that really him? Am I overreacting? Do I ask him if he was following me? Just a number of things were racing through my overactive imagination. Or so I thought. I decided I was going to message him and just say, had a good time, good night. And when I started typing, all of a sudden a message came through to my phone of a picture of my car outside my house. I nearly died. My heart jumped out of my chest. I started shaking. I didn't know what to say. And he texts me and says, I didn't know you lived across the street from me. I've met my neighbors, and not once have I ever met him. There's a huge apartment complex kitty corner to my townhouse, so maybe that's where he lived, I don't know. I popped up and went to look outside, and there he was just standing there outside like he was waiting for me. I opened the door and he asked if he could come in, and if I wanted to still hang out. I told him I was exhausted, and I'd rather just crash out as it had been a long day. The next morning I woke up to go to work, and my windshield had been smashed. My car was keyed, my back 2 tires were slashed. And as I was noticing the damage to my vehicle, the guy comes out of his car with 2 coffees and is like, oh, I thought I'd surprise you with a morning coffee. So again I'm freaked out. I called the cops and reported the damage to my vehicle. This guy offered to drive me, and something in my gut was like, don't get in that car. So I called my boss, told them the situation, and explained I wasn't going to be there until after the police came. This guy just hung out the whole time, BTW. When the police finally got there, this guy was acting really suspicious. He walked away and was hiding on the other side of his car. I filed the report. The police basically said, hope you have insurance, and we're on their way to leave. They pulled around the corner, and all I heard was the siren on the cops' lights turn on, and the cops scream, freeze, put your hands in the air and get down on your knees. I look, and the cops got his gun drawn at this guy, and this dude's on the ground getting arrested. I spoke with the cop after he got into the back, and he explained he was wanted for stalking, breach of probation, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and aggravated sexual assault. I was shook. It took me a couple days to get over the hypothetical situations that could have happened. About a week later I was on my way out the door to work, and guess who was sitting in my driveway? We live in Canada, so essentially you're released on conditions until you go to jail. I told him I was late for work, but that I'd call him when I was done work. I never went to work that day. I went and found a new apartment on another area of the city. I also changed my phone number and hired my friend's husband and his friends to go pack my apartment up and move it to their place for a month, and then move it to my new place because I was so scared this dude would follow them while moving. So that's my horror story of the first time I used Plenty of Fish. I'm a 31-year-old guy currently using my GI Bill to go to college in a city in one of the mountain time zone states. I'm so busy with school and work, so I don't have time to go out and socialize often, so I have to rely a lot on the apps to go on dates. I matched with this really cute girl around my age. We had a good convo, and then we scheduled a date. It was at a bar restaurant not far for either of us to drive, so it was easy. She was very pretty in person, and we got along great. During our conversation, I found out that she worked in a non-cop role at the police station, like a receptionist essentially. I also learned she had a roommate, whom she said was out of town for the holidays. She added that she hated being alone because she had a crazy ex-boyfriend who stalked her. I was a little uneasy at that and told her as much, and she said he's harmless, so I kinda let it go. We had a few more drinks and were there about another hour, and at her suggestion, she said we should go back to her place. And I wasn't going to argue it, she was hot lol. She then insisted on driving. I told her I was fine, and she said no, that I had been drinking, and she saw too many DUIs at her job. I got what she was saying, but I only had 2 gin and tonics and was fine, and again she insisted. I thought it was weird, but I didn't care. We went to her house and she walked up and just opened the door. She didn't unlock it, it was already open, which I found very odd because she said she had a stalker and that her roommate was gone. She started feeding her cat, and as she was doing that I saw a bowl of cereal on the kitchen counter. I touched it, and it was still cold like it hadn't been there for a while. The cereal wasn't soggy either. I asked her whose it was, and she hesitated and said she ate it as a snack before heading to the bar. It just didn't make sense, and before you could say anything she just kissed me and out her arms around me seductively, and said for me to take her to her room. Again, she was pretty hot and I quit caring about the cereal lol. We started fooling around, and I went to close the curtains, and she told me to leave them open. A few minutes later, maybe 5, we were in bed, and my back was to the window, and she let out a huge gasp. A scared gasp. Her eyes were at the window. I turned around and saw someone in a hoodie, and they took off. I heard the steps running on her back deck. I immediately jumped up and ran out to make sure her doors were locked, and of course the front door wasn't. I ran to it and locked it, and right when I did, the door started banging. I went to open it because I was gonna fuck the dude up, or try to, and she told me to just go back to bed with her. I screamed at her and asked if she was insane, and she told me he does this and goes away. And I asked her, "You know this is your ex?" And she said yeah, and to not worry about it. At this point, he started banging on the side of the house on the other end, and she didn't seem at all scared and kept trying to get me to go back to her bed. I didn't want to call the cops because for all I know this dude is a cop, or she'd know the cops that showed up and would take her side. I also couldn't just leave because my car was at the bar, and I was terrified. At this point I started calling her out for the door not being locked. The cereal, I openly called her a liar. She couldn't come up with any logical answers, and I had no idea what I was into. I shouldn't have done this, but my fight or flight was pretty much kicked in, and I told her, "If this is a robbery or some kind of setup, I promise I will kill you both." I'm not a hard ass or anything, but my fear told me to let her know that no matter what it was, they'd have a fight on their hands. My thoughts of what were going to happen to me were all over the place. I ordered an Uber off my phone and didn't tell her. I just kept arguing with her and asking what was going on, hoping to just keep her talking and in the room. I stayed right next to the door so I could leave ASAP. Luckily I never got my pants off, and my jacket and shoes were right by the door, so I was able to get dressed. The Uber showed up, and without saying anything I just opened her door and ran out as fast as I could. I looked back at the door, and she was just standing there. It's only been a little over a month, but I honestly have no idea what the fuck I was into. I don't believe the story of just a girl with a crazy ex based off of the factors I told you. It feels like either a robbery or some weird fetishized cuck type thing. I don't know. Definitely something I'm very mad at myself for. I'm a 9-year Navy vet and allowed myself to get into a situation like that. I reported her account on the Uber ride back to the bar, and I told the bartender as well if they ever saw her in there again. I'm a young, 20s, gay man with a high sex drive. As such, I frequent Grindr, Scruff, etc. looking for opportunities to have sex. I have a thing for older men too. I don't really care how old as long as they don't look like my grandpa. I live in a big city, but even so, Grindr and Scruff can be pretty dry some days. A lot of the guys I'm into aren't attracted to me cause I'm a lot younger. I'm also not white or muscly, so I don't get an abundance of attention on those apps in general. On those dry days, the wise thing to do would be to nut quietly by myself and go to sleep peacefully. But like any other 20-something man, sometimes my second head takes over and decides that sex tonight is a life necessity. I don't always meet someone in public first, but I'm pretty good at hooking up safe. I have a checklist of things that I will send one of my best friends every time I'm meeting someone. Screenshot of the online profile, all face pictures they gave me, a first name, their phone number if I have it, social media profiles if I have them, where we're meeting. I'll text them regular updates when I'm on the way over, when I've made it over, and whether or not the guy is the guy in the pictures. If we ever move locations, I text them an exact address /app /room number immediately, or turn my location sharing on. Once it looks like the dirty is about to start, I'll let them know a time by which I'll text that I'm safe. And my friends are pretty awesome, so they look out for me. One thing to note, if a guy offers me a drink while I'm with them, I make sure it's in a sealed can or bottle, or they let me watch while they pour. Most people are actually very conscious and deliberate about this nowadays. It's nice. A couple months ago, I figured I'd start proactively casting a wider net for those nights that the apps are dry. I joined this site online specifically catered to the gay older/younger crowd, very early internet days /retro in terms of UI. Eventually I get a message from this guy. He sends me a kind of low residential picture of him in oversized glasses and a sweater/button-down combo. I read his profile and he's 71, enough for me to think that's old. And I can't quite tell if I'm attracted to him from the first photo. I message back asking for a second, and good sign. He sends one over without fuss. Again a bit low residential but without the glasses, and I think yeah okay maybe. His profile says something about how he's from the UK, and he's quite tall, so I figure British accent tall daddy? It'll be novel at least. Reading further on, he prattles on about how he likes meeting people who are strong-willed and breaking them down to be completely submissive to him. Sounds hot. We exchange phone numbers and text on WhatsApp a bit. He seems a bit arrogant. He starts telling me people often say he looks like a movie star. He looks way better in real life. Apparently he chooses poor pictures intentionally, so people get pleasantly surprised when they meet, and is telling me how he can tell that I'm smart by the way I text or something. Heard it all before, but I have a bit of a high tolerance for this brand of old man bullshit posturing at this point. He lets me know a date he'll be coming in and staying in a hotel downtown a month later. I figure I'll probably forget about him by then and never message him again. And then a month later rolls by, and it's another particularly dry night on the apps. I'm having a need sex now night, and I remember that guy I was talking to from that site. I hit him up on WhatsApp. Sure enough, he's in town, and tells me where he's staying. I tell him I'll be there in an hour. You disease-free? He takes a while to respond. Eventually he says he is squeaky clean. We'll talk about it when you get here. I'm like, okay, sounds good. Text one of my friends the usual. I'm a little more nervous for this one, just 'cause he seems a little odd, and I kind of trust the apps a bit more weirdly. It's much easier to tell if someone is a legit person when they live in the same area as you. I figure it's a hotel. You can't be planning anything too awful for me. I show up to the hotel where he's standing in the lobby, and lo and behold, he looks exactly like his pictures, just much less happy and a bit more droopy. His shoulders hunch almost halfway up his neck. His torso is bent back at the waist a bit too much. He almost looks like he's imitating a confident cartoon character. But he is quite tall. He has a foot on me. I say hi. 2 words to describe the way he came across, preoccupied and calculating. His eyes seemed to shift everywhere constantly, and when they landed on mine, they were freakishly piercing. I don't remember if he said hi back, but the first thing he starts talking about is how that family over to the right is hiding some great unhappiness and will never be happy with themselves. I ask, why do you say that? He says it's because they are giving so much attention to the kid and aren't talking to each other. I look over. Looks like a regular sister, little brother, and mom tired from the day of vacationing, waiting for their dad to finish up sorting something out at reception. By the way, he has a very strong American accent. Bummer. We walk to the elevators. The second thing he says to me is that I breathe from my lungs when I sleep and don't let my breath drop into my belly. I have some classical training as a performer, so I have a decent understanding of basic functions like that. Decent enough to try to forward the conversation with the absent-minded reply, no. I breathe low. Eyes lock on mine. A brief pause. Only a subtle change in tone. You want to know how I know that? I look at the way your lower jaw rests now. It kind of has this unsightly protrusion from the bottom of the skull where it should be resting. That probably happens overnight, when you start breathing from your chest, which makes that fat tongue of yours press up against your bottom teeth and deforms it. No. I'm pretty sure I breathe low when I sleep. Okay, no need to get defensive. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I've never experienced this level of agitation from anyone within the first 2 minutes of meeting them. I have been in emotionally manipulative relationships before, so the feeling was familiar, and weirdly intense for a first meeting. My brain kind of goes on autopilot polite hookup mode, and I figure maybe it'll be okay once we stop talking. He continues posturing as we ride up the elevator. He loves psychology and predicting how humans act apparently. We get off on his floor and approach his room. I quickly fire off the suite number plus, he's a little odd, in a text to my friend. As he taps his keycard, he glances at me over his shoulder. You don't need to text someone my room number, you know. Okay, well I just did. I'm a very trustworthy person. You have to trust me. Okay, I just do that with everyone I meet. The room is fairly normal, nothing too weird. His stuff is piled in a corner a bit haphazardly. Bed is made, lights are all on, normal hotel room. I see an open wine bottle on the desk. A glass of Coke and a glass of white wine are pre-poured. I take off my jacket and sit on the edge of the bed. He sits on the desk chair, starts quizzing me. Do you do this a lot? You asked if I was disease-free. What are you expecting to happen here? Because I am a squeaky clean guy, I don't have sex with people unless I am in a relationship with them. The reason I ask is people who do this a lot tend to be quite dirty and slutty, and eventually it catches up to them. Listen, I can tell you're a smart guy. I can tell you're a strong-willed person. What I really like is when a strong-willed person like you becomes completely submissive to me. I like breaking them. At this point I realize he's not going to stop talking, and feel like it might be a good idea to leave before having my pants down around him. But I feel frozen, on the verge of tears even. He is making me feel small, like a child. I see him smile a little. He likes it. I am sufficiently creeped out. Look, I don't really think we're a match here, so I'm gonna go. Okay, you're feeling unsafe. No, I'm not. I just don't think we're on the same page. Let me know what I can do to make you feel safe. How about you have a drink? No thanks. Diet Coke or wine? I look at the pre-poured drinks on the desk. I get a gut feeling that I should not drink them. I stand up. No, I'm really fine, thank you. I quickly get my jacket on and jump into a polite, nice to meet you, take care, bye. On my way out the door, he give me wrong directions to get down to the subway from the hotel. Tells me smart people take that route, stupid people take the long way. I say thanks and leave. I text my friend, holy fuck, I'm safe. And I take my normal-ass subway route home. Thank you very much. I pledge to stop letting my dick think for me. Young Harrison Ford, let's not meet again. I wanted to clarify that this has not been my normal experience at all on dating apps. I've met up with at least 100 partners by this point, and this was the worst experience by far. This isn't representative of what it's like if you use dating apps carefully and use your head. That being said, I've been dealing with mental health stuff and have grown a lot as a person since this experience. I feel like I am a lot more confident now, and I would never get this deep into this kind of situation again. Young gays/trans/NBS. Stay safe, y'all. Know your worth. Do not settle for bad dick. You are your own validation, not another person, no matter how horny you are. And yes, I really mean no matter how horny you are. All throughout high school there was a teacher who I had referred to as Creepy Creep. He deserved this name, and throughout this story I hope you can understand why. It all started in my freshman year. This teacher was an inclusion teacher, meaning he was in charge of taking care of the special needs kids that were allowed to be in the same classes as everyone else. Creepy Creep always seemed alone, and I always felt bad for him, so one day I complimented him on his haircut. I always regretted doing this because ever since, he was always in the same place as me. Later in my freshman year, I had broken my toe at a haunted house. After I came to school for the first time after I broke it, he stopped me in the hall to tell me I should avoid haunted houses. I just laughed it off, but later it hit me that it was really odd that he knew how I broke my toe because I hadn't actually told anyone at school. The next school year, he would always sit with me at my lunch table until my friends showed up. That same year he was running up the stairs and accidentally tripped, which I just happened to see. He seemed fine until he noticed I was one of the students who saw. He started crying, and later that day, he sat with me at lunch apologizing that he never wanted to embarrass himself like that in front of me. My junior year, he gave me this huge hug on the first day, telling me how much he missed me over the summer. This year he would always sit with me at lunch even after my friends would show up. He said my friends weren't true friends if they had a problem with us sitting together. One day at lunch, I was talking about how I was leaving early for a dentist appointment. He asked what time I was leaving, and I said right after lunch. Then a few minutes later he left, which I was honestly so grateful for. Once I got to my car to leave, it wouldn't start. Creepy Creep just happened to be out there though, and offered to give me a ride home. I told him it was fine because my stepdad was on his way to get me, and anyways he had to get back to school. Creepy Creep told me it wouldn't take any time for him to take me home since my house was just down the road. That's when I got really freaked out because he knew where I lived. Luckily my stepdad showed up just in time. Creepy Creep actually introduced himself to my stepdad, saying it was nice to finally meet the man who raised such a beautiful girl. My senior year I ended up going to a different school, and I got a new job as a delivery driver. About a week into the job there was a special note on the bottom of the delivery saying, "Bring to back door, and you can just walk in," which wasn't too odd to me because sometimes that's a common note on delivery for elderly people who can't make it to the door. So I made it to the delivery and went inside, but it was no other than Creepy Creep. When I walked in he went in for a kiss telling me how much he missed me. I was so terrified because not only was this my creepy stalking teacher, but he had also just kissed me. He told me how upset he was not to hear from me on our 2-year anniversary, but he said he understood because it's hard to keep in touch after being at different schools. He asked me to quit my job and just stay with him for the rest of the day, so we could celebrate our anniversary the proper way. Luckily my boss called yelling at me for taking so long on my delivery. So I told Creepy Creep that I had to go quit my job in person, so I wouldn't get in trouble for keeping the money from his delivery. Then I would come right back. He was so happy and said he was so excited to see me putting more effort into our relationship. So I quit my job and then went straight home and told my parents everything. I also haven't heard from Creepy Creep ever again. Up until junior year of high school, I flew mostly under the social radar and stuck to my status as a nerd girl. But when I was 15, I joined varsity cheer. My school's cheerleaders weren't popular by definition, but everyone kind of knew who we were because we were on the announcements, performed at pep rallies, and generally engaged with the students a lot. I made a lot of friends that year, and some of them happened to be the cool kids. For a while, I thought this was my long-awaited karma payoff for the years of bullying I'd suffered at their hands. I even developed a crush on one of them, a crush which the junior cheer captain herself volunteered to help me pursue. Homecoming is a big deal where I'm from, and I began to fantasize about my crush asking me to go with him. I'd heard rumors he was planning a dramatic proposal, and as homecoming season approached, I became more and more sure I would be his date. The junior cheer captain, who was close with him, kept dropping hints that I was right. One day at practice, she asked me what my favorite candy was, and I knew it would be so my crush would know what to give me. You can imagine my surprise when, after an exhausting theater rehearsal, I walked into the parking lot and was confronted by a guy I'd hardly spoken to asking me to be his date. My theater friends all applauded, assuming I was overjoyed. I saw both my parents in the parking lot recording the whole surprise. But most importantly, the cool kids I'd recently befriended were standing right there behind him, egging him on. I didn't understand why, because he wasn't popular at all. In fact, he was known to be kind of creepy. The junior cheer captain was laughing, encouraging him to give me the box of my favorite candy he was holding. She'd definitely orchestrated the whole thing. I didn't really know the guy, but I didn't want to humiliate him in front of the coolest kids in school, so I faked a smile and rolled with it. I promised myself I'd deny him later, in private, so he wouldn't be embarrassed. Afterwards, when my parents excitedly asked me how I felt about the ordeal, I explained how uncomfortable it made me. I said that I got strong, creepy vibes from the guy. That didn't fly with my parents. My mother accused me of having expectations too high, and my father demanded to know, not for the first time, if I was secretly a lesbian. I had never had a boyfriend or shown much interest in dating. To make his case stronger, I'd just become best friends with the only openly gay girl our school had ever seen. Long story short, I knew that if I shut down my date, I'd effectively declare war on my parents. However, I played my dad's protective instinct against him and persuaded him to let me friend-zone my date. After all, he knows how high school boys think, right? I texted my date that night and explained that I only saw us as friends, but would still be happy to go to homecoming with him. He was very polite about it, although I could tell he was interested in me romantically. It seemed we'd reached a deal until the next day at school, when one of my cheerleader friends referred to my date as my boyfriend. I corrected her and told her we're just going to homecoming as friends. She seemed confused and told me my date was telling anyone who could listen that I was his girlfriend. A few more of my friends approached me with similar comments, and I confronted my date about them. He denied all involvement and suggested it was just a rumor. I reminded him that we were just friends, and I had zero romantic interest in him. He said he understood. I got a call from the junior cheer captain. She pretended to be sweet and conspiratorial, but I was still annoyed that she'd led me to believe my crush would ask me to homecoming. She began her attempt to persuade me that I was wrong to friend-zone my date. She said that she'd spent many afternoons planning his proposal with him, and she knew he was kind of creepy from afar, but he was sweet and caring underneath all that. I said, if he was such a catch, she should date him. Annoyed, she dropped the sweet act. She told me that I had to date him, because he liked me so much, and he'd gone to so much trouble to ask me to homecoming. I had to give him a chance, because he'd gone out on a limb for me. I told her she was wrong, and I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do, and I owed him nothing. I ended up hanging up on her soon after that, but that was just the beginning. Starting the next Monday, he would corner me in the hallway and give me a rose he held in his teeth. He usually did so between my 6th and 7th periods, when my path through the hall crossed his. I was deeply uncomfortable with this and told him so, but he wouldn't stop. I took different routes to escape him, but the junior cheer captain and her posse made a point of tracking me down so he could find me elsewhere. Every time he did this, everyone in the area would treat it as a sweet romantic gesture, despite my obvious discomfort. Wouldn't any girl be lucky to have a boy so devoted to her that he gave her a rose every day? He was still telling everyone I was his girlfriend. The final straw for me was when he walked into a class he wasn't in to find me and give me my daily rose. My teacher, who was friends with the junior cheer captain, let this happen. For weeks afterwards, she would ask me about my date every day. When he came in, I told him to get out and leave me alone. His feelings were clearly hurt, and he left looking like a kicked puppy. My classmates started calling me a cold, hard bitch. It didn't matter what I had to say about him. I was a nice queen, refusing this sweet boy's advances. Everyone in the school had decided that I was in love with him, and nobody cared what I had to say about it. My crush, who was part of the popular group, joined the junior cheer captain in pressuring me into returning my date's feelings. At every event where the cheerleaders were present, my date would push his way to the front of the crowd. He would go to great lengths to get my attention. At football games, he would wave a flag in the student section so I'd look at him when we were cheering. The other girls would make comments on how endearing he was when he waited in the parking lot by our bus back to the school, just to hug me and tell me how great I did. I didn't know what else to do other than let this happen. I had only recently ascended to a position of visibility. If I conflicted too hard with the cool kids, who were so dead set on setting me up with this guy, I could be an outsider all over again. I hoped that if I just kept ranting to my real friends about how creepy he was and publicly let him do what he wanted, it would all blow over. My school had a 15-second attention span, so some scandal had to one-up me sooner or later. The truth emerged, as usual, in the locker room. It turns out the junior cheer captain had been telling him, during their afternoons together, that I was into him. He'd come to her for help announcing his crush on me, and she'd gone a step further and convinced him I felt the same, despite the fact that I didn't even know his name. She'd lied to him for weeks prior to the homecoming proposal, and when I told her that was wrong, she didn't care. She told me I should be grateful, because everybody was starting to think that I was gay. My best friend, the lesbian who was starting a gay revolution, and I, inspired, spread a rumor that we were dating. After all, everybody already thought I was gay, right? But my date wasn't fazed. In fact, he told everyone that he'd just turned me straight again. EW. 3 weeks after he asked me, it was finally homecoming night. Thanks to cheer obligations and a complete coincidence involving a switched backpack that left me without my dress, I ended up only attending the dance for half an hour. My date awkwardly stood on the side of the room while I danced my heart out to Mr. Brightside. I almost felt bad for him when, right at the end, the junior cheer captain appeared like a summoned demon to suggest we slow dance at the next opportunity. Thank God I escaped that one by walking to the DJ and suggesting he play Footloose. My date walked me out to the parking lot to wait for my mom to pick me up. While we waited for her to drive around, which took entirely too long because she still hoped I'd stop making a fuss and date him, he asked me out. I politely declined. He quickly stammered that we could go with a group of people, like the junior cheer captain and my crush. I denied him again and made it clear we were only friends, and I wasn't interested in romantic endeavors because I was too busy. That was actually true. I was in all advanced classes, varsity theater and cheer, and worked part-time. A few days later, a teacher eloped to Vegas, and nobody cared about my love life anymore. My date and I were distanced again by classes and activities and work. It appeared that everything was going back to normal. That Friday at the football game, my crush asked me to sit on his shoulders for the alma mater, kind of a romantic thing at my school. Overjoyed, I accepted, and I hoped this was the beginning of a new chapter for me. I ignored the frantically waving flag in the stands. Monday, my date stood on a chair in his second period class and announced that everyone should be wary of my crush because he would steal your girl. I heard everyone buzzing about it a few hours later, when someone called me a bitch, again, for breaking my date's heart. I knew I was being dramatic, but I decided not to go to lunch that day, terrified of running into him. I'm so glad I didn't. Later, I saw on Snapchat that my date had carved my name into his arm with a pair of scissors. His bleeding arm was screenshotted and sent to me by half a dozen people, most of them demanding why I'd hurt him like this. He did it in the middle of lunch in a crowded cafeteria, and somehow no administration noticed or cared. The school was buzzing. My date was a broken-hearted victim, and I was the evil, secretly gay bitch who wouldn't give him a chance. I got so many dirty looks. By fifth period, I was ready to just walk out, but my good girl instincts kicked in, and I decided to tough it out for 2 more hours. Around that time, I got a panicked text from one of my cheer friends. While she'd initially been insistent that I date the creepy guy, she'd apparently changed her mind after the lunch incident earlier. She told me that my date, who was in her 5th period class, was going off the rails. He had started out saying that he wanted to kill himself because I wouldn't love him. This had escalated to saying he'd kill my crush for lying to me and stealing me away. Finally, he'd started talking about how he knew where I lived. My parents had given him my address when he initially wanted to ask me to the dance at my house, and he would make me pay for wronging him. I knew that, after 6th period, our paths through the hall would cross. Since the beginning of this ordeal, the school had cracked down on students getting outside, and my alternate route to escape him was no longer an option. My class was at the far end of the hall with nowhere to go but into the central hub, and he would be coming from the other end of the hallway towards mine. I was stuck up a chimney, basically. Desperate, I texted the junior cheer captain to finish what she started and tell him that I was not and had never been interested in him. She'd made this mess, and I would make sure she had to clean it up. She said she'd go to the counselor, but she didn't know what else to do. This was way beyond her control now. For the first and only time, I skipped class. I hid out in the theater hall and waited for 7th period. I got a few texts during the passing period that my date was waiting for me by the bathrooms. There was a little alcove right there where you can't see people coming around the corner, and the thought of him hiding there and waiting for me to walk by alone horrified me. Right before 7th period began, a few of my classmates burst in, cackling, and proclaimed that my date was coming down here after school to kill my crush. They thought this was hilarious, but judging by the look on my crush's face, this wasn't a joke to him anymore. Our teacher brushed this off as typical theater drama, pun fully intended. I watched the clock and tried not to cry, knowing that by the time the bell rang my date would be outside, waiting for me and my crush to emerge. That day ended up being a work day, so my crush and I were able to escape the classroom and hide out elsewhere in the theater hall to get away from him. He opted for the black box theater, and I went for the lighting closet. Obviously, I didn't witness what happened, but my best friend filled me in afterwards. Allegedly, my date had turned up 3 minutes before the bell rang and stood outside the classroom, where we couldn't see him when we opened the door. He told everyone standing around that he was ready to have a knife fight with my crush. We don't know if he actually had a knife or not, but the idea that he might was enough to terrify me. His arm was wrapped in paper towels that he was bleeding through. My best friend told him my crush and I were gone, but he didn't believe her. He stood outside for 25 minutes, until the administrators began walking through to make sure no one was in the school who shouldn't be. My date wasn't in theater, so he wasn't allowed to stick around. That night, I texted him that not only would I never date him, but could no longer even see a friendship between us. I sent him a number to a suicide hotline and told him to get help. Finally, I told him that he needed to learn what no meant, and I never wanted to speak to him again. He responded that he was sorry and asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. I told him no. I don't think he learned the meaning of the word after all, because the same pattern repeated itself a few months later on Valentine's Day, the next year at homecoming, senior year Valentine's Day, and prom. But those are other stories. I've since graduated and gone off to college hundreds of miles away from him. My family back home moved from the address my parents gave him. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not gay. My crush, on the other hand, came out a few months later, and we were friends for the rest of high school. I'm working on handling romantic endeavors in a healthy way, but he got in my head. He was the first person to ever show interest in me. Ironically, the last time I saw him was my first, and only, homecoming game after graduating, but this time I had true friends to defend me when he predictably tried to pull some weird stuff with me. The worst part, looking back, was somehow being at fault for everything. To this day, people from my high school reference the whole ordeal as, "That time you wouldn't date that poor shy kid." I can't even appreciate red roses anymore. I answered some questions about details on part 1, which was the story you just read, which I'll repeat here to clear some stuff up. Part 1 happened in 2015, when I was a junior in high school, and I'm a junior in college now. I was 15 during this first homecoming debacle, because I'm young for my grade. Everyone else involved was 16 or 17 at the time. My parents, after all this played out, had very different reactions. My mother apologized for not believing me in the first place, and pressuring me to lower my standards. My relationship with her has become a success story in the past 4 years, and this experience jump-started its evolution. On the other hand, my father has rewritten the narrative entirely, and insists he never once advocated I go to homecoming with my date. He says he was always wary of this kid, and he also did never ask if I was gay. I'm not. I'm bi actually, but I didn't realize it until senior year of high school. I didn't go to the guidance counselor, yet, because she was known to be bad at her job, as you'll see in this continuation. She victim-blamed a lot, and she would usually bring up religion to solve students' problems, regardless of our school being public and non-religious. She was fired after I graduated in 2017. My high school and home district in general was an administrative nightmare. I've heard from younger friends that, after a massive staff turnover, things are starting to look up, but none of it improved during my time there. My story was perfectly in character for the level of ignorance my school expressed towards unhealthy activity. My date didn't, and doesn't, use social media, at least not to my knowledge. I've found an abandoned Twitter account that looked like it might belong to him, but it was last active in 2016. I have no contact with him at all anymore, which I guess is a happy ending. A few people have implied I'm making all of this up. They're not the first, and they probably won't be the last, to say so. Even I know this shit's wild, and that's why I didn't say a word about it for years. I don't feel the need to prove my honesty to random strangers on the internet. If there's anything I learned from this nightmare, it's that people will only believe what they want to believe. The truth is that I had a weird as all hell experience, and it's affected my life in a lot of ways. Believe it or don't, I still have to deal with its repercussions on a daily basis. This post is less of an update, since all of this happened years ago, than it is a continuation. Long story short, my ex-date didn't get the message after homecoming junior year, and he ended up pulling some seriously weird shit even until after we graduated. None of it was as epic as junior homecoming, but it definitely cast a shadow over the latter half of my high school experience. From here on out, due to his activity for the next 2 years, I'll be referring to him as my stalker. For the months after homecoming, things started to settle down again. I didn't have any classes with my stalker, and the only person I still had to deal with was the junior cheer captain. She would go out of her way to be nice to me, inviting me to parties and buying me coffee and giving me rides to games, basically bribing me to keep quiet about what a manipulative person she was. My stalker reappeared on Valentine's Day, 2016. I was still a junior, but I had almost forgotten that homecoming even happened when, halfway through my day, he cornered me in the hallway and gave me a rose out of his teeth. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I underestimated my classmates' appetite for drama. During 7th period theater, we were in the library computer lab. After the rose thing, my crush from fall semester, who had since come out as gay, warned us that my stalker was carrying around a present for me in his backpack. I thanked him for the heads up and told my best friend, Gay Revolution Lesbian. She and I were sitting together on the inside of a row when the bell rang. We stood up to leave, but the girl on the other side of me turned to face us, blocking us off from the exit. She was a close friend of the junior cheer captain's. She asked me what I was doing after school, and I knew that she must be trying to herd me towards my stalker, so I could collect my presents. I leveled with her and said I knew my stalker was waiting for me somewhere, and I told her straight up that I wasn't going to play nice with him anymore. She turned on the same old guilt trip as everyone else, telling me how much he cared about me and how hard he worked on these presents, but I refused to go. I knew I needed to get out of the school as soon as possible, before she just told my stalker to come meet me at the library instead of the theater hall. To get her out of my way, I said I'd go meet him after I went to the bathroom, and she moved out of the walkway. My best friend and I hid out in the bathroom farthest from the theater hall. I knew he wouldn't leave until he'd delivered his gifts, and we had rehearsal that day, so I knew I'd have to go down there sooner or later. My best friend suggested she go down and retrieve the presents for me, so he'd leave before I had to go to rehearsal. 2 more of my friends happened upon our bathroom crisis, and they decided to link up with my best friend on her mission. I waited in the bathroom while they went to intercept the gifts. 20 minutes later, they returned. Among the gifts were 3 boxes of my favorite candy, which I didn't really like anymore, thanks to this whole mess, an expensive Doctor Who jewelry box, and a full bouquet of roses again. They told me, laughing uncomfortably, that there had been a whole group of people waiting for me to walk into the theater hall. My stalker wasn't too happy to hand over the presents, but my best friend made it clear I wouldn't be coming to get them, so he could hand them over to my friends or never deliver them at all. After about 10 minutes, the group waiting for me dissipated, and my stalker gave away the gifts. I was so creeped out that I didn't keep any of them, not even the jewelry box, which was TARDIS-shaped and actually kind of cool. For my birthday a few weeks later, I got out of school after 4th period and went to a theme park with my cousin. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving or where I was going. My best friend told me my stalker had waited outside the theater hall for me with a letter and a rose in hand until the school kicked everyone out who wasn't in theater. I was assistant director and light crew for one-act play that spring. An acquaintance of mine who didn't keep up with gossip was in charge of making the program, and she mentioned how cute my boyfriend was for taking out an ad in the program for me. I was sufficiently freaked out, told her I didn't have a boyfriend, and asked to see the ad he'd paid for. It was a picture of my stalker and I from junior homecoming, along with a note that said something like, "Good luck, Saucy, I love you." I begged my friend not to put it in the program, and she didn't, seeing my obvious discomfort. She refunded him his money and made some excuse about a local business buying more ad space. He tried the same trick for the last show of the year, which I was actually in. He showed up to opening night and got kicked out for filming. The theater department has now instituted a widespread rule of checking with the person an ad is targeted at before printing it, which is more than school administration ever cared to do. During a cleanup day for theater the summer before senior year, a guy from a different school showed up to help. He had been talking to me over social media for a few weeks, and I knew I was his next target. He'd made a game out of going on a date with every girl in our department. Sure enough, he asked me out while I cleaned up the prop closet, and I agreed. He was decent looking, and he wasn't mentally unstable, even if he was a fuckboy. I also knew that, if I played my cards right, I could turn this to my advantage. He was using me, so I just made sure I got something out of it, too. We went on our date, it was okay, no weird advances or anything, and he bought me dinner. On the way home, I directed the conversation towards homecoming. He caught my drift and asked me right there, no muss, no fuss. I said yes. Senior year started. My new date was all the way over at his school on the other side of town. My stalker was in 2 of my classes, 4th period biology and 6th period English, and had the same lunch as me. I was hyper aware of him staring at me every day, but didn't want to make a big deal about it. I knew he wanted my attention, and I refused to give it to him. Instead, I went about my life as usual. I made friends with the teachers who were lunch hall monitors, so I could leave the cafeteria, effectively avoiding my stalker. I ate lunch in the theater hall with my best friend every day. I asked my biology and English teachers not to make me sit by him or work in groups with him, and they agreed, if somewhat reluctantly. They, like pretty much everyone else, thought I was a dramatic cheerleader making up stories. I was a senior, and I really didn't want to deal with the bullshit of a crazy stalker anymore. Not that I ever wanted to in the first place. Homecoming was even earlier this year than last year. In English class, my stalker sat near 2 theater girls who usually walked to 7th period theater with me, and he turned around to ask them for ideas on how to ask me to homecoming. They were in the camp of classmates who were amused by my stalker's antics, so they wanted to rile him up and watch the fireworks. They also knew about the fuckboy I was talking to, because theater kids are the worst gossips ever, and they gleefully told my stalker that I already had a date. He proceeded to attempt to bite his finger off in class, which went about as well as you might think. Obviously, he didn't succeed, but he did draw blood, and he terrified my 2 theater friends, who had incited his instability. He stared at me the whole time, and I sat on the other side of the room and ignored him. I didn't care what he did. I refused to give him my attention, and I wouldn't be intimidated by him anymore. After class, my two friends came up to me and told me the details of what had just happened. Together, the three of us approached the English teacher. She believed me fully this time. He was moved into a different English class by the next week. Side note, bless this teacher. She was the first adult I encountered who took action to protect me, and she continued to check in with me about the situation throughout the rest of senior year. Sixth period became nothing less than a sanctuary for me, because for once somebody believed me, and they were listening. I didn't have to worry about him after fourth period, because I skipped lunch every day. I was getting confident about my escape maneuvers. Edit, forgot to mention the third and weirdest self-harm incident. After getting kicked out of English class, he desperately wanted my attention, so he got a pass out of his class one day and found mine. He walked to the trash can outside the door to my class, and I watched in horror and disgust as he pulled out a tooth and held his face over the trash can, spitting out blood. I know I said I wasn't giving him attention anymore, but the kid just ripped out a body part. I feel like I'm allowed to be terrified. Then my usual hall monitor was gone, and I got stuck in the cafeteria. I had been out of lunch for so long that I had forgotten my stalker was in the same one until I accidentally made eye contact with him, staring at me from across the room like some kind of grudge ghost. The second I saw him, he started speed walking across the room to my table. I ignored him, hoping he was just trying to psych me out, but it didn't work. He sat down in the seat next to mine. I was freaking out. I looked at the girl on the other side of me and begged her to get him out of here. She simply laughed at me. A year before, I would have kept quiet and dealt with my discomfort for fear of people hating me, but I was a year older and already contracting senioritis, so I stood up, grabbed my backpack, and stomped out of the lunchroom. The hall monitor stopped me, asking where I was going and if I had a pass. I said I was going to talk to the crisis counselor, and he let me go, probably because he didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I walked directly to the counselor's office, signed in, and found myself sitting in her office a few minutes later. I told her the whole story from the beginning. I had been to her office once before, and she'd shooed me away after saying I was being too dramatic. This time, she didn't. Instead, she spent the greater half of the hour I was there asking why I hadn't come to her when all this started. When I finally got her to address the actual problem, her first question reaffirmed my fears. She asked me, after I told her about the self-harm and threats and general creepery, what about him made me so opposed to dating him? I thought I was going to scream. I had a gut feeling that the truth wouldn't get me anywhere, and I needed action. I didn't care how I got it done, but I needed him out of my life and definitely out of my classes. So, knowing full well her attachment to Jesus, I pulled the Saving Myself for Jesus card. I put all those Sundays being forced to go to church to good use, and it worked. She stopped asking me why I'd waited, why not just date him, and asked what would make me feel safer. I told her to get him out of my schedule, and she said she'd look into my options. Within a few days, I was called back to her office. She had gotten him placed in another lunch period, but biology was only offered fourth period, and both of us needed it to graduate. I still considered this a victory. I only had to see him for 50 minutes every day. She told me to come talk to her whenever I needed someone to lean on. She would make sure my teachers understood. Fun fact, junior year, my best friend was sexually assaulted by an adult man. When she left class mid-panic attack to go see this crisis counselor, she was told to pull herself together and get back to class before she missed anything important. My stalker found new methods of seeing me. My best friends didn't make the cast of Winter Musical, but I did. I didn't realize that I had been isolated until my stalker joined crew and regularly tried to intimidate me. He would drill holes in set pieces that didn't need work because I was sitting near them and he wanted to watch me flinch. He would steal the props I used and hide them in the shop, so I had to be near him to retrieve them. My new crush and I were co-dance captains, and she convinced her friend the set head to keep my stalker off stage at all times. After musical ended in spring, my new crush told me she'd heard my stalker was getting angry about me, playing hard to get. I was hanging out in the theater hall with a few crew kids, getting ready for one-act play, when one of them pointed at me shocked and went, "You're saucy?" He told me he'd seen pictures of my backyard. I was confused and weirded out, so he explained that my stalker had shown him pictures of my backyard and porch. I asked to see them, and he said he didn't have the pictures, he'd just been shown them by my stalker. I didn't really believe him, and he could tell, so he said, "You have a big bay window in your living room, a bunch of bikes on your back porch, and a big-ass rose bush. It was an accurate description. I don't know for sure how to explain that, but I've theorized that my stalker had, at some point, been in my backyard before we adopted our purebred Doberman. The Doga had freaked out in the middle of the night a few times, but we brushed it off. Now, I wasn't so sure. My bedroom was in the front of the house, so I tried to reassure myself by thinking he hadn't seen me changing or anything super scary, but it didn't really help. My best friend was disowned by her mother and stepdad, and within a weekend she was shipped off to live with her biological father. I told myself I could survive the next 4 months and graduate, and then I'd never see my stalker again. I persuaded my parents, as prom and graduation approached, that I only wanted one present, my best friend. They paid for her plane ticket both ways and flew her home to be my date to prom. I kept her a secret so I could surprise our other friends when she showed up at prom to dance with us. My stalker only briefly entertained the thought of asking me to prom, which I later discovered was the now senior cheer captain's doing. I guess she'd finally started to realize the full effect of her actions, because she'd told him he needed to leave me alone. I don't know what else she said, but he went eerily silent in the weeks leading up to prom. He still came to the last play of the year, but he didn't film me this time. He waited for me outside the auditorium afterwards, but I was with other people on our way to cast dinner, and he didn't try anything. At prom, my friends were elated when they saw my best friend had returned. We danced and talked shit and had a great time together. It was honestly one of the best moments of my life when they walked in and saw her. Of course, my stalker tried one last time to change my mind. My friends and I were sitting at one of the tables together, laughing and catching up, and I saw my best friend's expression turn into a glare when someone walked up behind me. I turned around to see my stalker, waiting behind my chair. I stood up, I was taller than him in my heels, and said as calmly as possible that he wasn't welcome here. I was also 17 and pissed off and feeling unstoppable, so I tacked on, "If you ever speak to me again, I'll rip your dick off." It was the last thing I ever said to him. My best friend flew away again, we all graduated, and everyone went our separate ways for college. I saw my stalker again at the first homecoming after I graduated high school, but he didn't talk to me. He just stared at me the whole game. Later, he showed up to my sister's fall play at our alma mater, and he asked a cast member where she was and if I was there. Lucky me, the cast member was one of my littles, and he told my stalker he needed to leave immediately. I guess this story has a happy ending. I got away in one piece, with no foreseeable appearance of my stalker in my future. To my dad, I do in fact like boys. I just like girls too. But for the sake of the subreddit and my happiness, homecoming date from hell, worst set crew member ever, and bringer of teeth roses and junior mints, let's not meet again. I know I'm not the only guy, or girl for that matter, who has resorted to online resources to get laid. In my book, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as both parties are looking for the same thing. I never lie about what I'm looking for. I'm always straightforward about looking for sex. Most of the girls I've met have been totally cool with it, and were looking for the exact same thing. There have been a few that claimed they were looking for just sex, when in reality, they were looking for a relationship. That didn't end well for any of us. That's why it's always a good idea to be totally honest with someone, including yourself. Her name was Heidi. I met her on a popular dating app. I was very clear in my bio about what I was looking for, and she seemed to be looking for the same thing. She was beautiful, and we sent a few pics back and forth, and did a couple video chats to make sure there was no catfishing or filters going on. It's never good when you meet in person, and they are nothing like their photos. She was just as gorgeous as she was in her pics, and she was into me too, so we set up a night to hang out. As a rule, I never put out on the first meet when it comes to dating or hookup apps. I want to make sure we're both into it, and no one is just going through with it out of obligation. That's just fucked up. Heidi said she was cool with that, and even respected it. We met last week at a local bar near us, and had a few drinks. She was amazing. Other than being drop-dead gorgeous, she was so easy to talk to, easy to just be with. She flirted like a pro, and had me regretting my rule of no sex. We ended the night with a kiss before she left in an Uber. I couldn't wait until Friday when I'd see her again, this time at her apartment. I brought a bottle of Fireball whiskey, her favorite, and some bearskin condoms, my favorite. Her apartment was on the 8th floor. The elevator was out of order, so I was stuck taking the stairs. The apartment building itself was not too bad, but it had a strange smell that permeated the entire place. I hoped her apartment didn't smell like that. It was a scent that made me sick the longer I smelled it. I knocked on her door and prayed my clothes didn't pick up the odor of the place. It took her a few minutes to come to the door, even though I could hear her in there moving around. I called out to her, asking if she was all right. I could hear a faint murmuring, as if she were talking to someone. On the phone I guessed. I called her name loudly and knocked again, and heard a loud sort of scraping sound coming from inside. I started to worry, thinking she was hurt or in danger or something. I pressed my ear to her door and listened. The second my ear touched the wood, something crashed into the door, causing me to jump back from it. I even screamed, something I'm not proud of. A half a second later the door opened, and Heidi was smiling back at me, wearing just a big white t-shirt. Her hair was a mess, like she'd just gotten up, and for a moment I thought she was sick. I was about to ask if she wanted to reschedule, but she jumped into my arms and pulled me into a tight hug. She smelled funny, like something damp and old, but not as awful as the smell in the building. I thought I could at least tolerate it for a few hours. She grabbed me by the hand and pulled me into her apartment, leading me to the sofa. It didn't smell inside, but that was possibly due to the dozens of candles she had lit all over the apartment. I guess she was trying to cover up the stink of the building, and didn't want to bring it up in case it embarrassed her. She pushed me onto the sofa, a bit harder than I'm into, but I went along with it. I asked if she was okay, but she just smiled and licked her lips in an attempt at being sexy, but totally missed the mark. She stood in front of me, swaying to music only she could hear, her eyes trained on me unblinking. I was watching her move, trying like hell to enjoy it, but it just felt weird to me. Something about her felt off. "You're hot, I'm hot. Sexy sex," she said, her voice much deeper than it had been previously. "Yeah," I said stupidly. "This shit was weird, what can I say? Eat me," she moaned, roughly lifting her shirt. I might have gone through with it if her belly hadn't looked like she was 9 months pregnant. It's not like I have anything against pregnant women, but she wasn't pregnant when I'd last seen her the week before. And it looked painful, hard and swollen, and bulging in some places. It was an immediate turn off. "You look like you're not feeling well. If you want to call it a night and do this another time, I'm cool with it," I said, trying not to sound rude. She made a sound, a cross between a burp and cough, and quickly squatted and threw up on the floor, a dark black or red liquid that smelled just like shit in the building. At that point I was pretty much done, and sure she was either high or very ill. I jumped to my feet and started asking if she needed me to do something. Call someone, anything. She looked up at me grinning, her pupils almost as large as her eyes, and growled, "Look, I don't know if you're on something or not, but sex isn't going to happen tonight," I said. She jumped to her feet, so fast I dropped my fucking keys I'd been subconsciously holding in my fist for protection. I went to pick them up, ready to bolt the hell out of there, but she scooped them up before I could even bend down. "Give me my keys. I want to leave," I said sternly, holding out my hand. She laughed, deep and throaty, and held up my house key, staring at it like it was something she'd never seen before. "Heidi, I'm serious. Give me the damn keys," I said, no longer caring how rude I sounded. I was on the verge of calling the police when she did something I'll never forget. I'll never get this image out of my mind as long as I live. Heidi stood with her legs spread wide and dangled the keys playfully in front of me, well out of reach. She winked at me, and with her other hand lifted her shirt to reveal her bulging belly underneath, and with the other hand, she thrust my house key hard up inside her. I nearly fucking fainted, especially when the blood began to trickle down her thighs onto her beige carpet. "Fuck! Are you fucking crazy?" I screamed. She laughed again, continuing that same horrific thrusting motion. For a split second, even though she was smiling, I could see her eyes full of fear and pain, silently pleading with me for help. I backed up to the door, my hand fumbling to open it. I didn't want to take my eyes off her, not for a second. "Want to see?" She giggled, and she opened her mouth so wide I thought her jaw would snap. I stared at her in frozen horror, watching as something creeped up her throat, resting on her tongue. 2 pale fingers wiggled in the back of her mouth, the nails painted a pastel blue. I screamed, trying to twist the lock on the door. Heidi snapped her mouth shut and smiled. She lunged for me, grabbing my arms and pushing them against the door as she brought her head closer to mine. I screamed for help and tried pushing her off, but she was stronger than I was. I thought I would die in that smelly-ass apartment, but I was able to wrestle out of her grasp and somehow managed to get my keys from her. I pulled the door open and booked it down the hall. I looked back only once, to see Heidi standing in the doorway, her face twisted in an expression of rage. I ran down the steps, falling more than once. I got to my car and got the hell out of there. I called the police, but I didn't know exactly what to say. I just said a girl was harming herself. I didn't hear back from them or Heidi. I stopped using apps to meet women, although it's not a sure thing that I won't run into something like that again. I drove past her apartment last night, just out of curiosity. The building is no longer being used and has been boarded up for some contamination. But something from the windows was watching me as I drove by, smiling down at me from the 8th floor. I'm terrified now and thinking of moving, because I never did find my fucking house key. I will try to keep this short as possible. I am taking serious as true and not a serious topic, as this is obviously humorous, the black bean soup incident. I went to a small engineering college, and there were like 9 girls in my program, one of which was extremely hot and very cool. I was neither, but can be funny, and I use that to my advantage. Over the course of 6 months, I slowly woo her to the point where I am fairly confident that she will say yes upon asking her out. This was in the 90s, by the way, when you still had to manually ask girls out. A few more weeks go by, and I finally ask her out, and she accepts. I am completely smitten with this girl. I pick her up at her sorority house, which is an awkward deal if you have never done it before, because a dozen girls answer the door to check you out. I take her to the best restaurant I can find/afford, and so far everything is going great. I order a bowl of the soup of the day and an entree. She orders something inconsequential to the story. As you can guess, the soup du jour is black bean soup. The waiter is this much more attractive than me, late 20s guy who is obviously scoping my date and subtly flirting with her. So my machismo is activated so much so that when said waiter suggests I order the cup of soup versus the bowl, as their bowls are very large, I take it as a shot across the bow of my fragile masculinity and insist that I can handle the bowl. The bowl is delivered, and it's more of a tureen. You easily could have fed a family 4 with leftovers, but now my dumb ass has to not only finish it, but do so acting like it's normal to eat a gallon of soup, as I made a big deal of it. I eat the soup, and I am already Thanksgiving stuffed when they bring out my entree, which I obvious have to eat as well, or admit to handsome waiter and date that I'm an idiot with such a fragile ego that I can't take an obvious suggestion. Despite my obvious physical discomfort, my date cannot seem to tell that I am so uncomfortable that I may explode from either end at any instant. Furthermore, as I get up to use the bathroom, my date asks if we can stop by her sorority house on the way to our movie, so she can pick up a sweater for the cold theater. Despite the obvious, I say, no problem, and we get up to leave. As I am walking to the car, I get what feels like a knife to my belt line, followed by a gurgling noise as 8 pounds of shit are transferred from my intestines to my colon. I'm still not worried though, as we drive to her place, as it's like 5 minutes to the theater. We get to her sorority house, and she asks if I need to come inside for anything. I would like to think she wanted to fool around, but I think she has now picked up on my situation, probably from my profuse sweating and silence. No, I'm fine. And she heads inside to get her coat, and do God knows what else, cause she's in there for what feels like an hour. Then another sharp pain, another gurgle. I have now sweat, literally through my clothes, as I realize I have to shit, and I have to shit now. I get up and run to the front door, which isn't helping my situation any, as I desperately scramble to fling open the front door to the sorority house, locked of course. It's too late. I run around the side of the house, drop true, and proceed to shit my brains out, pressing my back hard against the side of the building in an attempt to keep from contaminating myself. I was not successful, though I immediately felt physically better. As I put myself back together, I realize, in sheer terror, that both my shoes and lower parts of my pants have been splattered. I start putting together a plan of action. Run to the car, run home, explain later, when as I am heading to my car I spot my date, sitting patiently in the passenger seat. Somehow on the spot I come up with, what I thought at the time, was a brilliant excuse, that I also have to stop by my house to change, as I stepped in dog shit while relieving myself on the side of her sorority house. She spared me from having to explain why I could not wait to use the bathroom at the theater. I assume she was distracted by the horrible odor in the car, but more likely she know the truth. Whatever the case, the angel did not make me elaborate on anything, and we had a great time the rest of the evening. This was one of the first dates I ever went on. I knew him a bit through college and friends. He was out at a student night, and we hit it off and had a bit of a kiss. He had a room in a shared house in the center of town, and he invited me over later that week. I arrived there expecting to be going out on a date or for a drink or whatever, but there were loads of his friends there in his room. Bit weird, but I knew them a bit and they were a nice crowd. I thought we'd be heading off on our own shortly. Nope. My date totally ignored me like I wasn't there. One of the girls said to him, "Hey, date's name, look who's here?" He said oh hi and nodded, then went back to chatting, not including me at all. I sat awkwardly making small talk with some of the girls, giving him curious looks and trying to catch his eye. Nothing. Everyone decided to go to someone else's house to watch a film, so I trailed along with them, him striding off in front, and me near the back still making small talk with some of the girls who I didn't really know. I was too green and awkward to realize I should have bounced then. Sat through a film at a relative stranger's house while he continued to ignore me. Awkwardly said bye to everyone after the film had finished, still hoping he might acknowledge me and walk me to the bus stop at least. Nope. So I had a bit of a scary walk to the bus stop through town alone at night, feeling pretty puzzled and embarrassed. Saw him around college afterwards, and he was always standoffish. Cool, you don't like me after all then, I guess. A year or two later, I was out at a club, and he was there. He was like, "Oh, I knew you'd be here," and gave me a really weird, gushing over the top apology about how he'd treated me. Tried to hug me repeatedly, and buy me an apology drink, which I politely refused. He literally followed me around, and eventually stood on his own, gazing at me lovingly at the edge of the dance floor for ages while I danced with my friends. His hands were cupping his face while he stared up at me with a little indulgent smile, like I was the loveliest thing he'd ever seen. To the point where it was quite creepy. My friends were all like, "Who is that guy and why is he being so weird?" Not a damned clue. Back in college, I met this girl and asked her if I could take her out to dinner. She said yes. I was ecstatic. Well, then I had to figure out where to take her to give her an idea of who I am and what I'm about. So I tried to do something that was thoughtful. I've learned that there are two types of gifts, expensive and thoughtful. If you can't do expensive, which I couldn't, then you'd better go hard on the thoughtful. This was taking place in the US South, but she was a freshman from Pennsylvania. I started thinking about things that'd be new and interesting to her. The answer came to me in a flash. Bojangles. I would take her to Bojangles. It's cheap, it used to have fairly decent food, but most of all it's southern, and we'd be able to discuss regional differences in food and culture. Of course, it's also fast food. Really crappy fast food. The evening of the date arrived. I drove her to the place and talked all about fried chicken and the South and tea, and how it must be different from the North. We got there and ordered at the register, then moved down to pick up our tray of food. Fancy, huh? We waited and waited. I tried to make some small talk. You know, the small talk you make when something could interrupt your conversation at any moment. Then we waited some more and more. My dinner, fried chicken, was on the tray. The drinks were on the tray. Her sandwich was not. So we stood there with the silence growing more and more awkward. Minutes rolled by that felt like ages. Finally, an employee noticed us standing there and said, "Did you need something?" I said yes, that we needed her sandwich. The employee turned around and grabbed the sandwich from the place it had been sitting the whole time we'd been standing there and put it on the tray. It had been there since the beginning. Not a great start. I picked up the tray and started walking back to a table with her. But there was an issue. Bojangles used to have the best sweet tea, so I always got a large. The cups they use for the larges are the kind that are smaller at the bottom, so they'll fit in your cup holder in your car. That's great for a car, but not so great for balancing them on a tray. It fell over. Fortunately, it fell over onto the tray, but not before knocking her drink off of the tray onto the floor. She had gotten the smaller drink, which came in the wax paper cup instead of the plastic cup that the larges are in. That's important, because it means that when her cup hit the ground at about a 30-degree angle, the cup crushed and launched the liquid inside out like a cannon. Onto her foot, drenching her in Pepsi or Coke or some soft drink. Being gentlemanly, I went and got her a new drink. Got back to the table and started trying to eat. I had ordered fried chicken, which I realized would mean that I had to eat with my fingers, which was stupid on a first date. Not wanting to look dumb, I decided I'd try to avoid eating with my fingers by using the plastic cutlery provided by the store, which would have been a fine idea if not for the fact that Bojangles only provides you with a spork. Not a fork, not a spoon, not a knife. A spork. A plastic spork, to be exact. I'm trying to pry the chicken off the bone with this plastic spork, and it's going nowhere. I can't get the chicken off the bone. I dug in a little deeper and really pulled, which bent the spork back a little, which served as a spring to launch my chicken breast across the table. I actually caught it before it could hit the floor. I remember thinking to myself, well, just enjoy this chicken because this date is going nowhere. I decided to just forget it and eat the dang chicken with my fingers. She was obviously not going to be going out with me anymore, so I decided not to worry about impressing her. Just try to get out of the situation without looking any dumber than I already did. I reached down and pulled off a nice piece of chicken with my fingers, and I missed my mouth. Seriously, I jammed the chicken onto my face. I don't know how I missed it, but I did. I just missed, which of course smeared chicken grease all over my cheek. The girl was looking at me like she was waiting for me to tell her, "It's just a prank, bro." I felt so dumb. We finished eating in silence. Finally, I said, "Well, let me take you back to your dorm." I gathered up all the trash on the tray, walked over to the garbage can and accidentally threw the whole thing into the trash. All of it, cups, the spork, napkins, the tray. All of it. I looked at the girl, she looked at me, and we both ran to the car. I've had some other bad dating experiences, but this one took the cake. I also remember being shocked when the car started when we were leaving. After the night I'd had, I was fully expecting to have to walk the several miles back to campus in the dark. I was about 16, and as I was walking home from a mate's house passed by a bus stop where this good-looking older girl, 19 to 20, was waiting for the bus. I said "day" as I passed, and she said hi back, then called out to me, so I turned around and started talking to her. I don't remember what we talked about, but she said she lived just across the road, and we should hang out one time. I told her where I lived, and she should pop over anytime. So a couple of days later I get home from being out, and my dad said a girl came over asking about me, and he told her that I would be home later. She knocks at the door and I answer it, and we hug and she asks if I want to come over to her place. I just thought this girl was lonely and wanted a bit of company, and because we kind of hit it off with comfortable chatter the first time, she just wanted to hang out. She worked on the mines and was only back for a week every 3 weeks. We walked to her place, and she holds my arm against her like we were a couple, which I found strange, but whatever. She wants to stop off at the shops on the way, and the only thing she gets is strawberries and cream. I get none of these hints, and just think she likes to eat that stuff as a bit of a treat. We get back to her place, and both just sit on the couch, he legs over me as we chat, and she is dipping the strawberries in the cream and kind of seductively eating them, which makes me feel a bit silly because I never been in that situation. She asks if I wanted a bong hit, to which I accepted as I did, and still do, love a smoke of the wacky tobacco. We get wasted, and sit back on the couch. This time she is leaning up against me with my arms around her. She asks me if I want to do anything. Me being the absolute moron said, "Nah, this is nice though." After another hit and more strawberries, now she is feeding me, and I am feeding her. She looks up at me with a pouty little smile. "Are you sure you don't want to do anything?" "I guess we could go for a walk," is my answer. "I'm okay, sure." So we go for a walk, and I see one of my mates walking, so call him and we chat for a bit. He asks if I want to go kick the footy, and I said, "Yeah, sure." And basically leave this girl to go kick the footy. And that's how I remained a virgin for another year. It didn't occur to me that it was a bad date until I considered it from her point of view. I felt bad for her after it all sunk in while I was going to bed that night. I'm such an idiot. A few days later I went to her place and we hung out again, but it was very awkward, and the next time I went to see her the place was empty, and I never saw her again. I hadn't met him, but my friend worked with him. So he set us up. I was hesitant because I had gotten out of a bad relationship which culminated in an ugly breakup a few months prior, and I really wasn't looking to date. But I'd also kind of isolated myself and ultimately figured meeting someone new and having a night out couldn't hurt. Famous. Last. Fucking. Words. So it's about a week before the date, and Ben calls me. Asks a few basic questions, seems pretty normal but a little awkward, which I guess is to be expected because he knows next to nothing about me. Asks about my favorite color and where I'd like to go to eat and just normal shit like that. I tell him royal blue. Why? He says he was just wondering. Okay. I figured maybe he was going to bring a small, "Good to meet you, I hope this goes well, I'm trying to be friendly" sort of gift. Motherfucker shows up for our date with 24 white roses airbrushed royal blue. One rose would have been a sweet gesture. This is a bit much. He also informs me I'll be driving because his dad dropped him off. Of interest here, I'm 24 and he's 26. Says he doesn't want to learn to drive because he's scared of it. I ask if he was ever in an accident, maybe when he was younger, and nope. Just scared of the idea of driving. We live in a small city. From my house to the restaurant is a couple miles. All in town. In a small city. He critiques my driving the whole way. Why you drive closer to the left than my dad? You're half in the other lane. Be careful. I was nowhere near the other lane. I have never, to this day, and I am now middle-aged, been involved in an accident when I was driving. I'm a very good driver. We get to the restaurant. It's a regular Chinese buffet. One of the dishes is sweet and sour meatballs. The server comes over and asks how our meal is. Ben laughs, and when he does he sounds like a station wagon full of asthmatic seals, and says if I wanted meatballs I'd have gone to the Italian place across the street. Fuck me. What have I done? He then starts peppering me with questions, all beginning with if we start dating. If we start dating, how do you feel about spontaneity? If we start dating, how important is sex? He then tells me he's a virgin but is bisexual, although he has no interest in male genitals and has a tickle fetish. How important is sex with you, dude? Not at all. I'd actually rather die. Do you like massages? How many sexual relationships have you had? I'm allergic to cats. Would you consider rehoming him? My family is all out of state. Would you consider moving? I'm dying here. He then starts talking about his family, and then crying about his grandmother, who died when he was 8. And not just, while this came up, forgive me I'm a little misty-eyed. He's sobbing. Somehow I survived dinner. We get back to my place. This is like 2002 before everyone had cell phones in their pockets. He has to come in and call his dad. I offer to just drop him off, but he says his dad is at his grandpa's and he, Ben, doesn't have a house key, that his dad prefers to drive him. I say fine, but keep your hands to yourself, don't touch anything, and once you get a hold of your dad, wait outside. On the drive back to my place, he tells me, I always told myself that I would wait a minimum of 1 year before considering sex with my girlfriend, but if we start dating I may drop it to 6 months because we're both older. How would you feel about that? And if you ever stay over, know I have a picture of my GMA on my dresser. I won't take it down, but I will turn it around when we have sex, like I always do when I masturbate. So you don't have to worry about that. I have to be on camera. This has to be a joke. We get to my place, he comes in, calls his dad, and while he's on the phone my cat comes in the room. I pick him up, kiss him on top of the head, and say I'll feed him in a minute. Ben says, have any men ever been intimidated by your relationship with your cat? Because that just made me really uncomfortable. I mean, you kissed him and talked to him. I told him to few and get out. He tried to apologize, but I was just done. Practically pushed him out the door. The moron even left me a couple VMs that week wanting to go out again. Then his last VM was basically wanting an exit interview. If you won't go out, will you at least tell me what put you off? Because I really liked you, and I don't know what you think went wrong. I've spent the last 20 years convinced I was being pranked. The friend who set us up never spoke to me again. Edit. After thinking about him again, after all these years, I just looked him up on FB. He has a unique last name, so I'm positive it's him, as well as his profile listing the city we lived in. So yeah, no doubt. He lives with his sister, and has a job as a candy stock boy with Walgreens. He's in his 40s. He also has a picture of his room which has a bed that's like a bunk bed, but there's no bottom bunk. It's so cool. That's called a loft bed. You have a loft bed, dude. Just before my junior year in high school, our neighbors, upper middle class neighborhood, hit a rough patch and the wife took a second job at McDonald's. She was kind of a surrogate mom to me, and so I'd stop in and say hi every now and then. One of her coworkers was a Navy guy who decided he needed to go out with me. He was very much not my type, but he seemed nice and kept begging my neighbor for my number, so I succumbed to the pressure and said yes. The evening started by him running late. He called me from a pay phone saying he had a flat tire and asked me if I could help change it. I mentioned this to my dad, and he's basically like, I've got this, and goes to help. They show up an hour or so later and my dad, also a Navy guy, makes it clear that he does not like this dude. Find out years later that he'd mentioned her perfect little ass as a reason for wanting to date me, and sends me off against his better judgment with pepper spray. Head out to a local Mexican place where he proceeds to eat like an absolute pig, talk with his mouth full, rattle his glass of ice at the servers and curse. Well, like a sailor. I give him a slight pass on the bad manners considering he's been on a boat for a while, hoping it gets better. It doesn't. He He takes me to see Mr. Bean and spends the entire movie laughing so obnoxiously that the people a few rows behind us start throwing quarters at us. Not pennies, not popcorn or candy, but actual fucking quarters. I expect him to maybe stop, but he doesn't. In fact, it's like it isn't happening at all, and it continues. Slouch down in my seat and pray the movie ends soon. He drives me home and insists on walking me to the front door, even after I politely decline. We get to the porch and kisses me. This disgusting, gropey, completely unwanted kiss, and then says, "Let's go inside." Just as I'm saying no thanks and reaching for the pepper spray, my dad swings the front door open and says, "Get within 10 miles of my daughter ever again, and I will make sure nobody ever finds you." Guy ran so fast back to his car he practically rolled downhill. Never heard from him again, thank God. Not being big in the club, party, or dance scene, I tend to use online sites to get dates. Part of the problem is since I live in the middle of nowhere, every person I'd even consider dating is at least an hour drive away. Anyway, onto the story. So, I met the girl on the online site. Her profile was nice. Her pictures were neat. She had a little extra meat to her, but I'm perfectly alright with that. We started messaging, found out she was a gamer, she liked science-wise stuff, had a quirky sense of humor, and we messaged several times a day for about a month. When we finally decided to meet up, we decided on going to a fancy Asian restaurant that was halfway, so neither one of us needed to drive too far, which was my idea because I like being practical, especially when I was having job trouble at the moment. Well, when I arrived, I noticed a few details. Her pictures did not do her justice, namely that she was easily about 350 to 400 lbs plus. She was wearing a skimpy outfit that had her fat rolls pouring over the edges. She had high heels on which I could not comprehend how they functioned on account of the law of physics. She must not have practiced putting makeup on in a long time, because she looked similar to a clown, and when she spoke, oh God. I understand everyone has their way of speaking. I know of accents, speech impediments, and vernacular, but she spoke in a way similar to Harold Green from the Red Green Show. Whatever, this is all superficial, and not being one to judge too harshly, and I am not one to turn down a potential friend, I decided to just go with it knowing I had no interest in pursuing anything beyond friendship. Sorry, not a chubby chaser. So we go in, and the first thing I notice is when the ladies at front see her, their eyes go wide. They look at each other and begin to speak rapidly in Cantonese/Mandarin before the one at the desk greets us and takes us to our seats with only one menu. That was a red flag because my date didn't have one herself. Our conversations weren't anywhere near as complex or interesting as they were online, which was another flag because she seemed to not grasp the basic topics we covered, such as games, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, gardening, or even local politics. I would chalk it up as anxiety, but no, she had no trouble talking. She just had no idea about any of these things. Then she decided to start talking about sex. Yeah, no, I don't mind talking about anything really, but I don't want to hear about the amount of sex you've had, how you like your sex, what your last boyfriend did to you, your masturbation techniques, your sex toys, and just what you want to do to me. Not only is that rather inappropriate first date conversation topic, also EW. Finally, to save me from a topic that churned my stomach, the food arrived. And I saw just why she didn't need a menu. She pretty much ordered the entire goddamn thing plus several alcoholic beverages versus my soup, steamed rice, and Hunan pork dish. She proceeded to just a bit of everything, shove it on her plate, and then shove it in her mouth, showing the table manners of a hyperactive bonobo, all while trying to keep up the previous topic of conversation that I constantly tried to deviate from to something, anything, that wasn't an insult to my senses but to no avail. The night continued in this disgusting, sauce-covered trend for a few hours until she had basically eaten everything she ordered and had some of mine as well. The bill came to a little over $200, which I, of course, had to cover because she magically forgot any of her money. Sorry if it seems rude, but if someone wants to get some extremely expensive stuff, and I inform them beforehand that I don't have a lot of money, I expect them to chip in even a little bit. On our way out, she grabbed my arm, tried to pull me close, and whispered how she wanted me, and wanted me to come back to her place. I placed my hand on hers, smiled gently, and said no. Now please let go of my arm. Luckily she did, and so I gave her an extremely awkward hug, told her I was going home, and promptly jumped in my car and got the hell out of there. Last message I got from her, about an hour after I got home, was asking why I didn't find her attractive, and why I was such a pansy to not fuck her on the first date. I simply said, I would have nothing against continuing our conversations online, but I don't think we had much chemistry. She wanted to do a picnic of sorts, but it was July, incredibly humid and a bit steamy/rainy that day. She insisted we did the picnic deal. Spent an hour getting this table nicely set up with food, dessert, candles, a nice tablecloth, cushions for us to sit on comfortably. Had never done this, but was trying hard to impress. Was actually quite proud of the end result. She arrives 15 minutes late. There was no connection hardly at all. She was not talkative, despite spending hours on the phone texting for a week leading up to date. She said she loved Latin/Caribbean food, so I got takeout from one of the best places local, a kind of assortment of things. She didn't touch any of it. She sat and looked at the river in the background, and I asked her a couple of times if she was okay. If she would like to move closer to the river? Was there anything I could do to make her more comfortable? And she would just smile and say no, and that it was all wonderful again, while not touching a single thing except a bottled water she brought. I sat through this for almost an hour. Finally, I just flat out said, I guess I was expecting a bit more conversation or at least some engagement in this. I'm sorry it seems this date was a bust. And she just awkwardly smiled and said, I'm sorry too, I can see you put a lot of effort into it. So because I had nothing to lose, I asked her what was wrong or what I did wrong. And she responds, nothing really. I just think this is all a bit overboard for a first date. It's kind of cringe, like you're desperate. I can't even lie. My feelings were pretty hurt as I put together the date based on her cues and questions I had subtly asked. Even went ahead with the gross atmosphere of 90-degree weather and steamy, post-storm humidity. I wanted to respond, but I just bit my tongue and said, well, if you're not going to eat, I sure am. And I went to town on the food while she sat there. There was a couple sitting on a swing near us, and I went, hey guys, you hungry? And as it turned out, they were on a date, but were broke, so were just enjoying each other's company. And I invited them over to enjoy the table full of food with me. She left a few minutes after they came over, having said nothing since I started eating. And after she left, I had the best time with these two strangers, eating and laughing and telling them what happened, and both of them telling me I deserved better. I'm still good friends with them some 10 years later now. Never heard from the girl again outside of a single text later that evening saying, I'm sorry, that was a bitcha thing for me to say to you. I guess expecting me to respond, which I never did, just blocked her number and moved on. It was a Bumble date. I was very young, dumb, and spent a lot of time outside. He suggested I show him my favorite hiking trail, and I agreed. Totally stupid, but at least it was a busy trail, and the main loop was more like a walking path than thick wilderness. There was some light rain, so we sat in the car together waiting for it to slow down before we started hiking. He took his meds in front of me, which is no big deal. What was weird was he kept offering me one of his Klonopin, and I said no like 3 times. When we were hiking, we talked about our lives. He was new in town. He had wealthy parents who owned a second home in my town and let him move here rent-free. He had met a bunch of random people on Bumble Friends and let them all move into his home without charging rent. He was making an artist collective. They didn't make much art. They mostly drank and smoked weed all day. I told him I was in nursing school, and he said that it would be very hard on him for me to be in school if we got into a relationship. So I was already feeling like he'd be way too clingy. After hiking, we went to Target. He spent $50 on different kinds of socks and a laundry basket. His sense of humor was making weird noises at other people shopping, which was embarrassing AF. I drove him back to his car at the trail, and he left his socks in my back seat, so I had to meet him again to quickly give them back. My phone died, and by the time I got home I had 15 missed calls from him. I felt a bit creeped out by that. He had spammed me a bunch of texts asking if I was okay over and over. Mind you, it had only been an hour since we went on the date. We had only talked for a few days and gone on one date, so it was too much. I told him it was nice to meet him, but I didn't feel a connection. He didn't stop texting me. The next day, he tried to call me multiple times and texted again, asking if I was okay over and over. I ignored it. After a few days, he sent texts saying he had a dream I died, and it was so real he was looking for my name in the news. I didn't reply. He sent me a text that said, fine. This is how supervillains are born. Wild. I blocked him. Neighbor I'd known for a few months casually, just chatting outside the apartment. He asked me to go out dancing, at a well-known local place that was tons of fun. Of course I said sure, sounds fun. We were college students, only a few of us had a car. He was embarrassed that he didn't, but I said I didn't mind driving. I'm a grown version of a tomboy. I drove a pickup with a canopy, and he'd only seen me in work jeans, boots, etc. I wore a gorgeous black and white bustier, heels, had my hair up. His first words? "You're not wearing makeup." And he was actually angry about it. I laughed and said, "You aren't either." There was a moment. I could tell he was reconsidering the date, so I asked if he wanted to skip it. I wasn't pissed off, just trying to avoid an uncomfortable evening. He seemed to shake it off and said we should go. When we got to the club, a man was standing by his car with the hood up, so I pulled up next to him and asked what the problem was. He said dead battery, hoping someone would give him a jump. I said no problem, popped my hood, opened the back, and when I got back to the front my date had lifted the hood. I started hooking the battery following the directions, which apparently no male has ever done in all humanity, and it's always been fine. And he got pissed beyond repair when I stopped him when he was trying to help take over, and said we had to do it the right way. He started to argue, but I said my car, my risk, my way. The guy I was helping had the good manners to ask why it matters what order the jumper cables are hooked up. That was the last straw for the guy I came with. He said I was just showing off. We still went inside and danced. I had some grease on one hand that didn't wash off, I tried, and that bugged him even more. I think I enjoyed holding my beer with that hand all the more, knowing it bugged him. I can't say it was all that bad of a date for me, but it might be one of the worst ones for him. I kind of hope so. He showed me his car, and he pulled up a breathalyzer that was installed by the driver's seat. He explained that he had to blow in it or the car wouldn't start, and also every 5 to 10 minutes or so the thing would beep, and he would have to blow in it again. He made it seem like it was no big deal. He said jump in, and we can grab dinner. I said I'm just going to drive my own car to the restaurant, because I never let strangers drive me anywhere. He seemed totally shocked, but said okay. We got to the restaurant, and he said he didn't have any money, and asked if we could walk around a park instead. I said okay. This park was sketchy and gross. He immediately hiked his leg up really high on a tree like almost doing the splits, and said he had to stretch. He then tried to coax me to walk some isolated trails, and I flat out said no, and that I wasn't comfortable being isolated alone with someone I didn't know. He kept saying, "But you do know me." He then proceeded to talk about a bunch of boring nonsense. He asked if I wanted to go back to his place to have sex. I said no. He then got really annoyed and said he was wasting his time on this pointless date. I said I agree, and I'm leaving. I started walking back to my car, and he said, "Oh, I parked much closer. Let me give you a ride back to your car." And he put his arm around me hard and was basically making it so I couldn't get away. I played dumb and said something like, "Wow, you're so strong, do you work out?" Blah blah. He began walking me to his car without letting me move. I decided to play into it and said, "You know that you're holding me against you. I kinda do want to go back to your place." He lit up and said, "Oh yes, we can have so much fun." We got back to his car and he walked me towards the passenger side. By this point he had let up a bit thinking I wanted to bang him. My heart started racing and my head was screaming for me to get away. I felt like if I got in that car I was doomed. Suddenly I said, "OMG, what was that?" pointing behind him. He turned to look and I fucking Olympic sprinted away. He started to chase me screaming at me, but he was too slow. He ran to get back in his car and peeled out trying to follow me. I called 911 and hid. I was able to give them his car and plate and description, etc. He didn't try to find me for long. He left the park and raced away. I stayed hidden until the police came. They drove me back to my car and said they would follow up with me, but that he hasn't technically done anything illegal. After that I only met in public in the daytime for dating. It was scary as fuck. 10 minutes prior to our date at a pumpkin patch, she tells me her daughter is depressed at home and needs to be around someone. She decides to bring her daughter to our date. Told her she can have the day with her daughter, real life comes first, etc., etc. She tells me, no big deal, she's going to meet her friend at the gate in a few, and it'll be just us after that. Daughter meets friend at the gate, friend brought her foster sister and her friend. At this point, there are now the two of us for the date, and 4 girls from 11 to 16 years old following us around. They weren't bad kids or anything, quite the opposite. Was a little weird at first, but they were fine to tag along. Then, when the kids finally run off on their own for a bit, we decide to hit the little pop-up bar in the middle. She can't get in, has no ID on her. No purse, her wallet was just a fancy phone case with odds and ends. I don't mind paying. I think it's kind of a dude's job to pay on first dates anyhow. But it was the expectation that I would take care of it that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Her phone then died, which meant she didn't have Apple Pay either. Either way, I'm determined to have a good day. We skip the bar and I grab us drinks at a little cider stand, and we continue. Kids come up and tell my date they're all hungry. You can probably tell where this is going. And even though the date isn't going to plan, I'm not about to let foster kids go hungry on a day where they should be out having fun. Fed the kids from the little restaurant they had at the patch, and felt bad after watching the youngest rip through her food in what felt like a couple of seconds. She clearly hadn't had enough that day. Quietly asked her if she'd like to order seconds. She said no, but I told her not to be afraid to ask later if she changed her mind. Kids had a good time, I made sure of it. Got home from the date, and date's psychotic addict ex had already put up posts that mentioned me by name, and how he's going to fight me, and all kinds of other shit. Which was hilarious in its own right. I'm twice his size. Immediately bowed out from there. In 2020 I was young and kinda desperate. 17, and just looking for people to hang out with really. So, I met this guy on a dating app. He seemed nice enough. Not my type, but had potential for a glow-up, you could say, so it motivated me to give him a chance. He was 22, and I was stupid. It was a hot summer afternoon. I met up with him on a corner between our houses, and we went for a walk. He was friendly, too friendly. And he stunk. He was absolutely fucking rank. Just imagine the worst body odor you've ever smelled in your life, and times that by 3. Now, I was trying to give him a chance, but he was wanting to hold my hand, and all I could think about was how dirty his fingernails were, how greasy his hair was. OFFS, just thinking about it right now is making me gag. We ended up sitting under a tree to talk, and he beckoned me to sit next to him, where he then put his arm around my shoulders. I turned my head away to just get a whiff of a fresh breeze, because otherwise I'd fucking pass out. He's putting his other hand in my leg, nodding his head, until he says, Yeah, this could definitely be something. Gross. Anyway, I offered to get us ice cream after he made it known he didn't have any money, and we walked him home after that. He lived with his grandparents at the time, in their basement. He offered to show me around, and politely I agreed, until he took us downstairs. We got into this whole virgin talk, you know how it goes. I told him I was, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for that yet. He puts his hand on my knee and tilts his head towards a mystery room. I can take care of that for you right now. I excused myself and ran home. I burned the shirt and exfoliated like hell when I realized his sweaty BO smell had soaked into my shoulder. I know this may seem like I was super superficial, but like I said, he wasn't really my type, and on paper his interests and hobbies seemed sweet enough. He was just down on his luck currently, so I thought I'd de-sweep my judgment to the side and give him a chance. Holy fuck, I sometimes feel like I can still smell him.